Today I want to invite you to turn to Paul's letter to the Ephesians, to chapter 2, verses 19 to 22. Ephesians, as you may recall, is written to, and Paul is talking about how in Christ God has broken down the dividing wall of hostility between Jews and Gentiles. And boy, how we need God to continue to break down walls of hostility today between different groups. And in verse 19, Paul writes this: "So then, you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are citizens with the saints and also members of the household of God." Again, this week we are talking about being part of the family of God, or the household of God. And in this household, part of what Paul is writing about in Ephesians is how there are members of the household, or members of the family, who actually may have some significant differences. There were significant differences between Jews and Gentiles in the first century. Jews coming from their unique and particular faith and belief in God, and all that that meant in terms of what they wore, how they had their beards, what food they ate, practicing a Sabbath, not wanting to acknowledge anyone else as God, including the Roman emperor. I mean, very distinctive things from Gentiles who didn't bear any of that history or any of the teaching and the law from the Hebrew Bible. And yet, Paul, who stood firmly coming out of that Jewish tradition, and yet sees himself now as the apostle to the Gentiles, is trying to bridge that gap in the household of God. And whether that is in the church today, and by church I mean church with a capital C, not just Brewster Baptist Church, but we need to also learn how to live together with people who may in many ways be very different than ourselves. In the church, you have people from every rung, if you will, of the socioeconomic ladder, people from every place when it comes to educational backgrounds, people who come from truly even different countries, people who have very different views, opinions, and perspectives about a host of issues. And yet, in and through Christ, Paul would say, He is our peace, as he says in verse 14 of Ephesians 2, "In his flesh he has made both groups into one and has broken down the dividing wall that is the hostility between us." And so in Jesus, we are a part of the household of God with people who in physical or earthly or human terms we may not have a whole lot in common with. And yet, if we share a common love for and commitment to Jesus, we are called to welcome and to love one another as members of God's family. That seems to be an important role for Christians to play in our current situation in our country and in our world. We are to be people who knock down dividing walls and build bridges of relationship in Christ.